Tonight, as Dave has said, we're going to continue with our study of the vision of the wild beasts. And just a brief recap on what we looked at last time, just to remind you. We saw this vision that Daniel was given. And the vision starts with the great winds striving on the Mediterranean Sea. And then we saw those beasts revealed one after the other. The lion with the eagle's wings, and the wings were plucked, and it stood up on its feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Then we saw the bear raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, as it says. And then we saw the curious figure of the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings of a bird on the back of it. And finally we saw the terrible 4th beast with the 10 horns and the little horn that grew up after the 10 horns, and before whom 3 horns were plucked up by the roots, and the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things. It was a dramatic vision that Daniel was given, one that moved him greatly and worried him and distressed him. And we saw the interesting layout of the chapter, the way it's broken up. And we saw that rather than being the vision of the wild beasts, as we've phrased this series, the vision really is one of the triumphant saints under the leadership of the Son of Man. And you can see there's a 3-fold emphasis on the beasts and how dreadful their reigns would be, but also a 3-fold emphasis on the judgment that's going to happen on those beast systems, and a reassurance 3 times that the kingdom will be given to the saints, that the Most High will judge, that the Son of Man will come, and the kingdom will be given to the saints of the Most High. Now, I prepared a handout, which you may have seen. I've printed it out like this, and you can fold it in half, and if you like, it's a useful way to divide up Daniel chapter 7. It aligns the 3 sections and shows you all that's happening with the 4th beast, because the details of that beast have to be pieced together like this. They're scattered throughout the chapter, and it's difficult by just focusing on one section. You can miss some of the details that come out in the other sections. So an email went round about that with a link to it in 2 different formats. Feel free to pause me and print this out if you want. You don't have to print it at all if you don't need, because I'll be putting it on the screen, but it'll probably make it easier to follow through if you've got a copy of it. So last time we looked at the first 3 of the beasts, and in brief summary we lined them up with the metals of the image in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And they lined up in the following way. We had the head of gold representing Babylon, which corresponds with the lion with the eagle's wings. And then we had the silver, which corresponds with the bear, the Medo-Persians, the brass, which aligned with the Greek Empire, which was the 4-headed leopard with the 4 wings. And finally, we had the Roman legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay, that Roman Empire that started strong with the 2 divisions that came, and it was broken up and divided, and it continues in that state even to this day. And we're going to suggest tonight that the 4th beast corresponds with those legs of iron, the Roman Empire. And we're going to see just how detailed Daniel chapter 7 is. And when you see it, I think you'll be amazed at just how much information was recorded by God and given for our benefit, to prove beyond all doubt that God wrote this chapter. And it can give us incredible comfort, not just that God is in control, but the parts that are not yet fulfilled are going to happen as well. And as we know, those parts relate to our salvation, the kingdom of Christ, which we are looking forward to, aren't we? So there's a number of curious details which we're introduced to with this 4th beast. We're going to look at that tonight. So on the handout, I've pieced together the first and the second descriptions and the interpretation, and I've tried to align in rows the corresponding statements so that you can see very quickly the details as they come out. So let's just have a look at some of the details that Daniel reveals about this fourth beast to help us try and identify who it's actually talking about. So we're told, aren't we, at the very start, that this fourth beast is dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong, and it's going to be the fourth kingdom on earth. We're told that it has teeth of iron and brass nails, and it's interesting that detail. We've got the Roman and the Grecian elements mentioned in Daniel chapter 2 coming through in some curious way. It mentions that it devours and breaks in pieces and stamps what's left with its feet. It devours the whole earth, if you look across at some of the other sections there, and it has terrible destructive capabilities. It's a very ferocious and powerful beast. And then you'll notice that the focus shifts from the terrible beast, and Daniel looks and notices the head. And the head has these 10 horns. And then there's a little horn which grows up among the 10. So these 10 horns, which represent kings, usually in prophecy, this little horn grows up after those 10 horns are established. So this can help to chronologically establish at what time period we're looking at in terms of the identity of this curious little horn. So it says that 3 horns are plucked up by the roots. It subdues 3 kings, as it's interpreted there. I'm just going to scroll up a bit. He shall subdue 3 kings, as it says there in that 3rd section in Daniel chapter 7. And it's got the eyes of a man, and it speaks great words against the Most High. And then, terribly, it also persecutes the saints of the Most High, and they suffer at the hands of this dreadful fourth beast. It makes war with the saints. And there's also the details there given that it thinks to change times and laws. And it says there that those times, that the power of this beast, of this little horn, is given to it for time, times, and the dividing of time. And we'll have a look at that detail in a moment. So what about the judgments on the beast? It says in this next section on the handout that you've got, and also up here on the screen, that the judgment comes because of the great words which this little horn speaks. And because of the words, the blasphemous words that this little horn speaks, the beast is slain, its body is destroyed, and it's given to be burned. And if you have a look at that second to last section there, the second to last row on the table on the screen, you'll see that in the first section on the left, it's describing that the beast is slain and destroyed. And you might assume, after the times, and dividing of times, that beast is gone, it's destroyed and wiped out. But that's not necessarily the case, because in the third section, the right-hand column of that handout, you'll see that it says, "They shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it unto the end." So we're not necessarily saying, Daniel 7 is not necessarily saying that the beast is destroyed after the times, and dividing of times, but the power of the little horn, his dominion, is taken away, and that signals the end of the fourth beast. A very interesting and a precise little detail, which it's good to take note of. So before we get into what we're looking for, I just wanted to show you a little bit of maths. So we're going to blend some history and some maths tonight. What does it mean when it says the time and the times and half a time? And you'll see there on the screen, there's a little table I've got. And people have been, this isn't me that's made this up, or even Christadelphians as such. This has been interpreted widely in the Christian community. A time is ascribed to 360 days, which was a Jewish year, 360 days. Times is 2 times, 2 single times, so it's 720 days. And half a time is half of 360, which is 180. So I can see some mathematical brains whirring away in the background. It's 1,260 days. So 1,260 days, and there's good scriptural precedent for us to interpret days as years when God gives us these time measurements, these time periods. So we're looking for this little horn power to have its power and its ability to persecute the saints and change times and laws for 1,260 years. And it has to be coming out of the place where the 10 horns are, and 3 horns have to be taken out for it. There's a bunch of details, and let's just go through it. Let's go through them and summarise them all on the screen for you now. So just pulling together what we've looked at briefly, as Daniel chapter 7 covers it. So it's the 4th kingdom. It comes after the Greek Empire. It's very powerful. It's ferocious. It devours. It breaks in pieces. It stamps with its feet. It has iron teeth and brass claws. And these metals, as we mentioned, are used of Greece and Rome in Daniel chapter 2. And the teeth and the claws are both weapons. They're both separate abilities of this beast to be able to kill and maim and devour and destroy. And perhaps it's referencing 2 sides to the beast. Maybe I'm reading into that a little bit. The empire is going to, at some stage, turn into 10 separate empires because the horns are on the head of this beast. And then after these 10 kingdoms, another one's going to rise up, which is different from the others in some way. This horn's going to have eyes and a mouth, and it's going to speak great things, as we saw. Now, the little horn, it starts small, and then it grows in influence and power. And it takes over 3 of the 10 horns on the beast. And it becomes dominant. The 7 that remain almost fade into the background as Daniel watches the vision. And this little horn takes control, doesn't it? And becomes, as it says, more stout than his fellows. So they fade into the background, as we've said. Now this power, because it speaks great words against the Most High, that really puts it in the domain of a religious power, doesn't it? It's not very often that a political power would speak great words against the Most High, but a religious power, a corrupt religious power, would certainly be expected to do something like that. And not only that, it notes that it persecutes the true believers of Christ. So it's not just content with being corrupt and with speaking against God, it wants to persecute those who follow God in truth. And it thinks to change times and laws, to have control and manipulate things to suit its own ends. And as we said, it's going to remain in power for 1,260 days, the times, and the dividing of time. And then its power is going to be taken away afterwards. So that's an astonishing amount of detail, isn't it? To help us identify what this 4th beast is talking about in the book of Daniel. It's an amazing amount of detail. And, I mean, the Bible's really being honest, isn't it? It's being upfront and open and not afraid of criticism at all. It's put itself out there, and it's been recorded like this for more than 2,000 years. And it's been open to criticism the whole time. But the facts of the matter are, incidentally, that even the most hardened critics of the Bible, they would lock in the book of Daniel, and when it was written, they would say, oh, it wasn't written at the time when it says it was, 550 BC. It was actually probably written more, later on, say 3 to 200 BC. And they say that this prophecy is talking about the Greek Empire. They kind of water it down and try to minimise the wonder of this passage, as you'd expect a skeptic to do. But even so, if it was written 200 BC, the details that are given here in this prophecy are absolutely astonishing and accurate and show beyond all doubt that God is the true author. God is behind this, and he's given the precision that we require to have our faith strengthened as we look at this chapter. So when Daniel's watching the vision unfold before his eyes with the 4th beast, there's really kind of 3 phases of this 4th beast. You'll see, first of all, he sees the beast itself, and it's ferocious and it's stamping around and crushing and breaking in pieces. Then he sees the 10 horns on its head, and then he sees the little horn. So I've divided them up into the 3 different shades of blue there on the screen to show that Daniel 7 is indicating there's 3 stages to this power, which can help us even further to identify it. So when we're looking at prophecy, if you're really wanting to have proof that God writes something, this is my demand for a prophecy and whether it's authentic or not. First of all, I'd want to make sure that the prophecy is absolutely crystal clear and you can understand it and there's no double way of reading it. I would want to make sure that it's very detailed, very specific. I'd want to make sure that the prophecy was incredibly unlikely to just play out or be guessed by someone who's pretending to prophesy something in the future. I'd want to make sure that the prophecy was speaking about stuff which was going to happen a long way into the future, and I'd want to make sure that when that prophecy is fulfilled, it's fulfilled precisely and accurately with no mistakes. And I think you'll find that this prophecy in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7, and particularly with the 4th beast, because there's so much detail given of this beast, you have to wonder in amazement at the power of God to reveal these things to his servants, to those who tremble at his word and are humble enough to read it and seek to understand it. So let's now try to get into the identity of this 4th beast, and I will issue a warning here. There's lots of history coming up. Can't really avoid it if we're trying to work out what this beast is all about. I'm not particularly a history buff. I did struggle. I spent a lot of time trying to piece together some of the information here. But it's a very rewarding exercise when you finally come to the realisation of the precision of this particular prophecy. So, who is the 4th beast? I've probably already given you some clues, haven't I? We talked about it before. It's clearly the succession to the Grecian Empire, so that naturally means it's the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire at the time defeated the Greeks in roughly 168 BC, or maybe exactly 168 BC, and they ruled under the Caesars right up to 351 AD, where they started to be challenged by external powers to the Roman Empire. So they ruled for nearly 500 years like that. The Roman Empire split into 2 in about 395 AD into the East and the Western empires, because the empire was so vast it was difficult to manage it. And in 395 they split it down the middle, East and West, roughly in the middle, and the Eastern Empire was ruled from Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul in Turkey, and the Western Empire was ruled from Rome in those times. And the Eastern Empire continued for quite some time, right through to the 1400s, where it was defeated by the Ottoman Empire, whereas the Western Empire was taken, most historians accept that it was taken in about 476 AD when Rome was conquered. So when Rome was conquered, it wasn't actually succeeded by a 5th beast or a 5th kingdom. It actually crumbled and disintegrated from within and was attacked by numerous different barbarian hordes which came to it from all sides and attacked it. And it is interesting to note that in history there were other empires that rose up after this, but the focus of this prophecy, as we've already seen, is focused on the Great Sea where the beast rise up. So some of the history that God, he looks over it, not because it's unimportant or he doesn't care or he's not in control of it, but because it's not relevant to the focus of his purpose, which is with the saints and it's with Israel. So the Roman Empire, which we're going to look at tonight, had particular effect upon the saints, as we'll see. So when the Roman Empire broke up, it was basically rotten to the core and falling apart from within, and that made it vulnerable to attacks from all sorts of barbarian tribes, as we mentioned before, which were outside of the territory of the Roman Empire. So that naturally opens up the possibility that the Roman Empire and the form that it was disintegrated into after the barbarian or the non-Roman armies came in and conquered the various little sections of the Roman Empire, you would naturally want to associate them with the 10 horns. And you can't really get around it. There's more than 10 groups of barbarians that came into the Roman Empire and conquered at one stage or other different territories. And I'll just put a few examples up on the screen here for you. They've got the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Franks, the Saxons, the Celts, the Thracians, Parthians, Picts, Lombards and Burgundians, to name a few. The point is, the Roman Empire was divided up into lots of fragments, and 10 is actually used in the Bible as a symbol of many different divisions. And that might sound like a cop-out, but given that we're so far along in history, it is difficult, I think, to define exactly which 10 kingdoms God is talking about in this book of Daniel. I'm sure that originally there probably were 10, but I found it quite hard to identify them. Sorry if you don't like that explanation. So, as we've already seen in the book, in this prophecy of Daniel, after these 10 kingdoms, it says that another kingdom will rise up. Now, I said that the capital of the Roman Empire, which was Rome itself, that fell to the Goths under one of its leaders, I can't even say his name, Odoacer, in 476 AD. And that's the generally accepted time when the Roman Empire fell. So we're expecting this little horn power to come up after the 10 horns are established, after the Roman Empire is fully divided up, sometime after 476 AD. And it's going to last, as we said, for 1260 years. And it starts small and grows in power, and 3 powers are plucked up by the roots in front of it. So who is this fourth power? Is there a power that exists among the Eastern Roman Empire, which, as it was divided up, that corresponds to these details? And unfortunately, yes, there is. Well, fortunately as well. The problem is that it identifies a system, a religious system, that exists even today. It identifies that system as the little horn. And I'm not identifying this power because I necessarily hate it or have anything against it in that sense, but the Bible is the tool that we use to identify things. And when the Bible points it out in such clear and unmistakable detail, how can we say anything else other than to point it out and identify it? So the horn is part of the body in any animal, isn't it? And it was the same with this particular power. It began very early in the Roman Empire, and in fact it was connected with the early Christian church. And its power and its influence still is felt today, but it's not like it was in the time of its glory in the past. So the starting point of this little horn has its origins in the church itself, and it began with the early ecclesia, and the custom was to appoint a head over each ecclesia, over each little church, as they became known. And those leaders were called bishops. And of course, you had a whole bunch of churches throughout the Roman Empire because Christianity itself was the accepted religion of the Roman Empire after Constantine. But the teachings of the church had become corrupt by this point and distorted through various traditions and misunderstandings and false teachings. So eventually, some of the churches rose to prominence, while others directed their questions and their and diverted their authority to these greater churches. And the Church of Rome, in particular, kept rising and rising and rising in prominence. And its bishop continued to gain power amongst the church in the beginning. Now, there's a number of interesting things that I'd like to point out that happened which gave the Roman bishop and the Roman church itself particular power amongst the church. Now, in trying to pinpoint the exact start of the little horn, it's quite difficult because there wasn't a one event that happened which started the horn power. It had been there since the very beginning and growing beneath the surface, and when it pushed its way through and started to come into existence and become obvious, it was a process which had a few defined events which led to it coming to power. So I'll just list a couple of them for you. And sorry if you struggle with history like me, but it is actually quite fascinating. It's just quite difficult to pin it down to a single event. And I don't think it's really intended for us to do that. So there was an emperor, an emperor of the newly sort of formed conglomerate of nations which had taken over the Roman Empire. His name was Justinian, and he produced legislation, or he wrote commands and published them and sent them out to all people, trying to reform and to modify some of the laws and bring them up to date, which had been around for a while. And in those reforms, he gave particular notoriety to the Bishop of Rome, and he said in those reforms that he was the universal pope, or the chief of all the priests of the church. This Emperor Justinian was quite a meddler in religious affairs, and later in his life he became quite involved in the way that the church worked itself out. But he was instrumental in saying to the world that the Bishop of Rome was the one at the very top that everyone should defer to. So in 539, the same emperor, he conquered Ravenna in Italy, and he installed the Pope in that place. He gave him a place, a physical place, a territory for him to rule over. And he also, later on, in 549 to 554, he proclaimed that Rome itself, once the centre of the Roman Empire, that was under the authority of the Pope. And then later on, there was a decree made by another emperor, the Emperor Phocas. He decreed that the Pope was head of all the churches. He made an official declaration, he put it in writing, he affirmed what Justinian had said 70-odd years before, that the Pope was the chief bishop, he was the head of all the churches. And so the little horn power was established. At this time, the Pope didn't have, vast influence over people. He didn't have his own dominion as such, but he was there and he was a force to be reckoned with. And all of the churches deferred to him. He was the one that had the authority. So after this, the only way was up for the Roman church and the influence of the bishop. And he just continued to rise and ascend in popularity and in power. And there was this curious relationship that was established between the church and the emperor of the empire at the time. And they worked together, and following Charlemagne, who was AD 800, the Pope actually crowned him and established a tradition that the Pope would crown and authorise, from the church's point of view, the next emperor. And that became a tradition that was followed right down through history for over 1,000 years. Pretty amazing. And in fact, in 758 AD, there was an emperor called Pippin, the Short. He must have been a short person, but he actually overthrew particular regions of the 10-horn divided Roman Empire, and he actually gave 3 of those sections to the Pope himself. So let's just have a look at those sections now. Pepin in 758, he gave 3 kingdoms of Italy to the Pope. And they were the Exarchate of Ravenna, sorry if I didn't say that right, the kingdom of the Lombards and the state of Rome. Those 3 territories were given to the Pope, and finally the Pope had what we would call, or what historians call, temporal power. It means he had a land to rule over. He wasn't just a power in word only. He had a physical territory to call his own and to rule over. He had his army, he had his people, his subjects, and he ruled over it. And this extract from the Encyclopaedia Britannica talks about the significance of this particular event in history, in the history of the papacy. He says that the donation of Pepin, who gave those 3 territories to the Pope, was an important step in the development of the papal states. They were the states that the Pope ruled over. They were the very beginnings of his territory. And they helped to solidify the alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchy. So that relationship was cemented by this donation of this king at the time to the papacy, the Catholic Church, and the Roman Church in particular. And so, over the next 1,000 years, this relationship between the Church and the state continued, and the Pope would crown the emperor to show his authority, and the emperor would swear to protect the Church, and he used the Pope as his confidant, and together they would work and bring out laws and proclaim things to suit their own purposes, of course. So the fact that the power of the papacy was enforced by the emperor, it meant that the papacy rose in power and preeminence above all the remaining kingdoms. And in fact, because it was the accepted religion of the day, the other kingdoms faded into insignificance when it came to this papal authority. And he wielded his power to great effect to suit the advantage of the church, the corrupt Roman church. And we're not going to go into details tonight about the blasphemies that this papal system has uttered over the years, but there are many, many examples of things that the Catholic Church has introduced which are found nowhere in the Bible itself. They're completely apostate and corrupt. You know, things like indulgences and purgatory and you know, paying money to the priest to get people into heaven when they've passed away, and all sorts of ways that they've manipulated and changed laws to suit their own ends over time, and then reneged and adopted a different stance because it suits their position better. These examples have been multiplied in history, and we just don't have the time to go into them tonight. But one of the interesting things I want to look at now is the judgment and the loss of power of the papacy. How did it all come about? How did it all play out? We saw that the power of the papacy was one that rose over a period of sort of 70 years, as we looked at before, with the declarations of Justinian, and then the Emperor Phocas declaring the authority of the Bishop of Rome. How did the power of the Pope recede and diminish? We'll go back to our slide that we put up before with those 4 particular events. And remember our time period of 1260 years that we said at the start? The times, and the dividing of times? Well, when you look at all 4 of those dates and you add 1260 years to them, the wonderful thing is that there's a significant bookend to the rise of the papacy that happens as the papacy's power is diminished over time. What do I mean by this? Well, Justinian proclaimed legislation establishing the Pope as the universal bishop in 529 to 533. And then around the time of the French Revolution, 1260 years later, the National Assembly of the Revolutionary France, they put into effect legislation which led to the destruction of the power of Catholicism. in 539, the territory of Ravenna was given to Italy, and in 1799, Napoleon fought various wars, and he pulled back the territories and reclaimed them from the papacy and wrested power from the papacy. And there was this continual tussle and struggle with people rising up against the papacy and removing power, and then that power being given back. But eventually, his power was taken away. We have, in corresponding to the proclamation of the authority of Rome coming under the authority of the Pope, Napoleon annexed the Papal States and devastated the Catholic Church in 1809 through to 1814 when he was finally stopped. And the final blow to the papacy came in 1870 when, under the leadership of Garibaldi and the revolutionary forces, they came and they took back the land of Rome, and the Pope's temporal power was completely gone. He had no dominion, he had no territory left to rule over. He was effectively a prisoner in the Vatican and locked up. He had no people to govern, and he couldn't wield his power anymore like he could before. So isn't that amazing? The precision of the Word of God and the way it predicts the rise of this power, and then 1260 years later, the fall of this power comes about. His dominion, as it says in Daniel, was taken away and consumed to the end. So the beast in its divided form still exists, but the power of that little horn has been removed. So let's just recap on what we've seen, the incredible detail of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7 and what it says about this fourth beast and this little horn. The fourth beast, as we expect from the prophecy of Daniel, it comes after the Greek Empire. Yes, it was the Roman Empire. It was powerful. It overcame the Greeks, of course. It was more powerful than the Greeks. It had the iron teeth and the brass claws. We hinted at, perhaps this is a reference to the east and the west divide of the Roman Empire, the two different military, if you like, and the iron of Rome and the brass of Greek, which those two symbols exist even today in the divisions of the Catholic Church, the Roman element and the Grecian element in the east. We saw that the Empire of Rome was divided into 10 kingdoms. We saw that this little horn rose up after that period of time in the 500s AD. We saw that 3 kingdoms were taken up, and that under the donation of Pepin they were given to the Pope, and he had that temporal power. He rose, and then 1260 years later his power was removed after he had inflicted persecution on the saints and changing of times and laws and blasphemies against the Most High, just as the prophecy of Daniel predicted, 500 years before the events even began to take place. But is this the end of the vision? We've seen the vision of the 4 beasts, haven't we? We've seen those beasts in all their awful detail and the precision of the Word of God. But we've also seen, haven't we, that this is not just about how horrible the kingdom of men is, how devastating it's going to be for the saints who are under its dominion and who are given into its hand for a time, times and dividing of times. We've seen that it's not just the vision of the wild animals, it's a vision of the triumphant saints and those reassurances we can take to heart. Reassurance that God is in control, that the saints will possess the kingdom. The kingdom will be given to the saints, as it says there on the right-hand side. The kingdom of the Son of Man will come, as it says in verses 13 to 14 of this chapter. It's a wonderful vision, and it's a wonderful reassurance for us. And perhaps we can keep in our mind, as we go to bed tonight, we can think about the final reward that God offers to those who tremble at his word, those who are the saints of the Most High. As it says in Daniel 7 verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people and nations and languages should serve him. And unlike the corrupt and the wicked kingdom of men, which destroys and stamps and crushes and pillages and does things to suit its own means, the dominion of the Son of Man and his kingdom is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And that's the kingdom that we're all looking forward to.